The train whistle faded into the distance, its cry swallowed by the dust-heavy air of the frontier. Evening light painted the station in amber, long shadows stretching across warped planks and weathered faces. Clara Whitfield stepped down with a trembling hand clutching a scuffed carpetbag, her boots meeting the ground with a finality that rattled through her bones. She was 20, with pale features softened by innocence and sharpened by the weight of survival, and though her dress was neat and pressed, it did little to shield her from the glances that clung like burrs. Townsfolk had gathered as if entertainment had been promised, their whispers rising like cicadas in the heat. "Mail order bride," someone muttered, and the words spread in the air like wildfire. "Poor rancher's desperate choice." A woman with thin lips and a hawk's eyes shook her head, whispering too loudly, "Virgin thing. What else has she to offer?" Clara's cheeks burned as though slapped. She kept her gaze low, focused on the cracks in the boards beneath her shoes. This was the price of stepping into a stranger's life, every stare, every murmur slicing away at the fragile hope she had carried through the long miles west. From the far edge of the platform he appeared. Jonah McGraw, the man whose letters had carried no flourishes, only the plain words of a rancher who needed someone to care for his child. He was taller than Clara expected, his shoulders broad, his sun-darkened face carved by years of labor and loss. His eyes, though steady, carried a shadow that refused to be named. He did not smile. Instead, he gave her a slow nod, stepped forward, and relieved her of the bag with a gentleness that surprised her. No welcome, no greeting, just the quiet solidity of a man who carried burdens without complaint. They walked through the murmurs, leaving the station behind. The wagon creaked as Jonah guided the horses along the dirt road, and the silence pressed hard against Clara's chest. She wanted to speak, to fill the emptiness, but his presence was like stone, offering nothing for words to cling to. She folded her hands in her lap and watched the countryside unfurl, the dry grass waving in the wind, the horizon stretching wide, as if daring her to lose herself in it. The ranch came into view as the sun sagged low. It stood proud yet weary, a wooden house whose walls bore the wear of weather and grief. Fences sagged in places, though the fields beyond carried the order of a man who worked without rest. Clara's breath caught when she saw the small figure waiting at the porch. A little girl, 6 years old, clutching a rag doll by the arm. Her hair was dark, her face solemn, though her eyes betrayed the fragile brightness of longing. Jonah's voice, deep and unused, broke the silence. "Annie," he said, and the girl stepped forward with cautious steps. She looked at Clara as one might look at a fragile bird, too delicate to hold, too strange to ignore. Clara bent, forcing a smile that wavered despite her best effort. "Hello, sweetheart," she whispered. Annie said nothing. She only retreated behind her father's leg, peeking out with shy eyes. Clara felt the sting of rejection but masked it, reminding herself she was the stranger here, not the child. Inside, the house carried a hollow quiet. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and worn leather, of meals cooked and eaten in silence. A large table stood at the heart of the room, set with 3 places but laden with the stillness of absence. Clara's chest tightened at the thought of the woman whose chair was now empty, the ghost of Jonah's late wife lingering in every corner. Supper was a stiff ritual. Jonah ate slowly, his eyes fixed on his plate, as though each bite required great concentration. Clara sat across from him, every movement of her fork loud in the oppressive hush. It was Annie who finally broke the silence, her voice soft but startling. "Do you know how to braid hair, miss?" she asked, eyes fixed on her doll's tangled strands. Clara blinked, her heart tumbling in her chest. "Yes," she whispered, her voice catching before she steadied it. "I used to braid my sister's hair." Her hands shook slightly as she spoke, the memory of her younger sister flashing before her, the one she had left behind to take this uncertain step. Annie's face brightened just faintly, the smallest spark of connection. Jonah lifted his gaze, listening, though he spoke no word. Clara felt the air shift, as if something unseen had leaned closer. days blurred together with a rhythm that both comforted and unnerved. Jonah rose before dawn, his boots striking against the wooden floorboards, the door closing behind him without ceremony. Clara busied herself with small tasks, straightening the linens, sweeping the porch, trying to carve a place for herself in a house that seemed to resist her presence. Annie watched from a distance, sometimes following her like a quiet shadow, sometimes disappearing into corners where grief hung heavier than dust. Yet the weight of the town pressed in. Clara ventured with Jonah to the general store, her head lowered as whispers followed her steps. Martha Kettle, sharp-tongued and always eager to wound, leaned close to another woman and let her words fly where Clara could not help but hear. "She's just a girl sold off, with no mother to guide her, no worth beyond her untouched skin." Laughter trailed behind like a cruel wind. Clara's cheeks flamed, her throat constricting. She wanted to vanish, to sink through the floorboards, but she forced herself to stand still, to breathe, to endure. That night, behind the closed door of her small room, she wept silently. The tears came not only from shame but from the gnawing certainty that she did not belong here. She was neither wife nor mother, neither welcome nor wanted. The house felt colder than the night outside, and despair curled itself around her heart. She thought of packing her bag, of leaving before dawn, though she had nowhere to go. It was then she heard soft footsteps, hesitant and small. The door creaked and Annie stood there, clutching her doll to her chest. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "Can you be Mama?" The words struck Clara like lightning through the dark. She sat up, her tears still fresh upon her cheeks, her breath stolen by the child's plea. She opened her arms without thinking, and Annie hurried into them, pressing her face against Clara's dress. Clara held her, heart breaking open with a tenderness she had not known she possessed. "I can try, sweetheart," she whispered into the child's hair, the promise trembling yet sincere. In that embrace, the emptiness of the house softened. The hollow silence gave way to a fragile warmth, stitched together by a child's hope and a woman's yearning. Jonah, standing unseen in the hallway, had paused at the sound of voices. He watched through the narrow crack of the door, his face shadowed, his heart caught between grief and the faint, unsteady pulse of possibility. Clara held Annie long after the child's breathing grew slow and steady against her shoulder. She knew the town would still whisper, that Jonah's silence would still weigh heavy, but for the first time since stepping off that train, she felt the faintest thread of belonging. Not to the house, not yet to the man, but to the little girl who had asked the only question that mattered. And in that quiet, Clara realized she could not leave, not while Annie needed her, not while her heart had finally found something worth breaking for. The days that followed settled into a rhythm Clara had not expected. Each morning Jonah left early for the fields, his broad back disappearing against the rising sun, and Clara lingered in the house with Annie, learning the silent language of a child's need. She brushed the girl's tangled hair, her fingers careful and patient, weaving braids that seemed to hold them both together. She hummed songs remembered from her own girlhood, the tunes fragile but steady, until Annie's eyes grew soft with comfort. The silence between them became less hollow, less filled with absence, more with the unspoken thread of trust being spun. Yet even as the bond grew, Clara could not shake the unease that Jonah's silence wrapped around her. He worked, he provided, he nodded when necessary, but he did not speak of the future, nor of what she was meant to be. The town's whispers only sharpened that fear. When Clara ventured into the dusty streets, heads turned. Martha Kettle's tongue was sharpest of all, her voice pitched for others to hear. "A child herself, hardly fit for raising another," she said, her eyes cutting across Clara like a blade. "What kind of rancher stakes his legacy on a virgin bride bought by post?" The words clung to Clara, feeding the shame she tried so hard to bury. She returned home with her head bowed, the echo of laughter ringing in her ears long after the sound had faded. Jonah noticed her silence at supper, the way she kept her gaze low, the faint tremor in her hands as she poured water into Annie's cup. He said nothing, though his eyes lingered longer than usual. It was Annie who filled the quiet once more, asking Clara to read aloud by lantern light, to tell stories that made her eyes widen with wonder. Clara gave herself fully to those moments, losing the sting of gossip in the sweetness of a child's trust. Still, she wondered each night if Jonah saw her as anything more than an arrangement, a caretaker filling the void left behind. When Reverend Abner Cole rode out to the ranch one morning, Clara sensed the weight of his presence even before Jonah returned from the barn. The Reverend's voice carried through the thin walls, stern and measured. "You risk scandal, Jonah. A woman in your house, unwed, tongues wagging. Either send her back, or make her proper before God and neighbor." Clara sat rigid in the next room, her face pale, her hands twisting in her lap. The door closed with the Reverend's departure, leaving the house in tense silence. Jonah did not speak of it, and that silence cut deeper than any words could have. Clara wondered if she would be cast out, if her place here had only ever been temporary. Yet she could not stop herself from giving more of her heart to Annie. When the child fell ill with fever, Clara stayed by her bedside through the long, sweltering night. She cooled her brow with damp cloths, whispered prayers under her breath, and held her small hand as though by sheer will she could anchor the girl to the earth. Jonah entered quietly in the dim hours before dawn and found Clara slumped with exhaustion, still awake, her fingers interlaced with Annie's. For the first time, something unspoken shifted in his expression, an acknowledgment almost tender, though he turned away before it could linger. Whispers in town grew harsher as the days stretched on. Martha Kettle spun her cruelty into sharper threads, hinting that Clara was not what she claimed, that no respectable woman would have agreed to such an arrangement unless desperation hid some ruin. The lie spread quickly, passed from porch to porch, until Jonah himself heard the mocking laughter of men outside the mercantile. "Fool of a rancher, taken in by a girl who ain't worth the dust on her shoes." That evening Jonah returned home with a heaviness in his step, the weight of those words pressing against his chest. Clara sensed it as soon as he entered, the storm in his silence. When Annie had gone to bed, he stood across from Clara, his voice low but edged with something raw. "Do you carry truth you've hidden from me?" His eyes searched her face, steady and unrelenting. Clara's breath caught. Her first instinct was denial, but the shame that had followed her since the train platform surged to the surface. Her hands shook as she spoke. "The truth is only this: I was untouched, but that was never my worth. I came here terrified, Jonah, and I have tried to belong. If I have hidden anything, it is only my fear. I do not know if I am enough for this place, for you, for her." Her voice cracked, the words spilling from her like a confession. For a long moment Jonah said nothing. The room held only the creak of wood and the steady tick of the clock on the mantel. Clara stood frozen, braced for rejection, for dismissal. Then a small cry broke the silence. Annie stood in the doorway, her doll clutched tightly, tears streaking her cheeks. She ran to Clara, pressing her face into the folds of her dress. "Don't send Mama away," she pleaded, her small voice breaking. The word, Mama, echoed in the room like a prayer, like an answer none of them had dared to speak. Jonah's face shifted, the hardness softening, grief and gratitude colliding in his eyes. He stepped forward slowly, lowering himself until he was level with them both. His voice, rough with emotion, carried the weight of a vow. "Stay. Not because the town says, not because I need a wife. Stay because we need you." Clara's tears fell freely then, not from shame but from the overwhelming relief of belonging. Jonah's hand, calloused from years of toil, reached for hers. It was not a gesture of possession but of partnership, a quiet promise forged in the presence of the only witness who mattered, a child who had asked the question that bound them. From that night the ranch no longer felt hollow. Annie's laughter rang brighter, filling the spaces where silence had once lingered. Clara found strength in the simplest acts, mending Jonah's shirts, kneading bread, tending to the hens, each gesture no longer a duty but an offering of love. Jonah's silence softened into presence, his eyes meeting hers with something steadier than words could provide. The town continued its gossip, whispers sliding along the dusty streets, but within the fences of the McGraw ranch, a family had been stitched together by fragile hands and quiet courage. Clara, once trembling on a train platform, now stood with her chin lifted, no longer defined by purity or shame but by the love she had chosen and the love that had chosen her. And so it was that a terrified bride became a mother, a stranger became a wife, and a grieving man found his heart remade. Sometimes it is not vows or sermons that bind a family, but a child's simple plea, spoken with hope enough to change everything.